The strange thing about fear is that the calmest person in the room is usually the one who's seen it before. Rain hammered against the windows of Flight 728 as the Boeing 777 cut through thick storm clouds somewhere above Colorado at 36,000 feet. Most passengers were trying not to look outside. Turbulence rattled the cabin every few seconds, sharp enough to shake drinks from tray tables and pull nervous gasps from the rows behind business class. A baby cried near the rear galley. Someone muttered a prayer. Another passenger laughed too loudly, pretending none of this bothered him. Seat 18A stayed quiet. Evelyn Carter sat beside the window with her hands folded loosely in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Long brown hair rested neatly against the collar of her gray jacket. No headphones. No movie playing. Just silence. Every few minutes she glanced toward the wing, studying something nobody else noticed. The man beside her finally sighed in frustration. "You keep staring out there like we're about to fall out of the sky." Evelyn looked at him calmly. "The left engine doesn't sound right." He gave a short laugh. "You a mechanic or something?" "No." She turned back toward the storm. "Just listening." Another violent shake rolled through the aircraft. Overhead bins rattled hard enough to make several passengers jump. A flight attendant grabbed the nearest seat for balance before forcing a professional smile back onto her face. "Everything's fine, folks. Just a little rough air." The captain's voice followed seconds later, steady but tense underneath. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be passing through weather for another 20 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. 20 minutes. The rhythm of the engine changed again. Barely noticeable. A soft, uneven vibration buried beneath the storm noise. Her fingers tightened once against the armrest. Across the aisle, a little girl clutched a stuffed rabbit against her chest while tears rolled down her cheeks. Her mother tried to comfort her, though fear was already creeping into her own voice. Evelyn leaned slightly across the aisle. "Hey." The little girl looked over. "Count the flashes for me." "What?" "The lightning outside." Evelyn offered a faint smile. "Every time you see one, count slow. It helps." The girl sniffled but nodded. Seconds later, another flash lit the clouds silver. "One." The mother mouthed a quiet thank you. Evelyn simply looked away again. A flight attendant approached her row moments later. "Ma'am, we need everyone seated upright." Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the rear of the cabin. "You might want to secure the coffee carts again." The attendant frowned. "They're already locked." Evelyn held her gaze for one silent second too long. "Check them anyway." Before the woman could answer, the plane suddenly lurched sideways so hard several passengers screamed. Somewhere behind them, metal slammed violently against a wall. The flight attendant spun around in shock. A beverage cart had broken loose in the rear galley exactly where Evelyn had looked moments earlier. The attendant stared back at her now, confused. "How did you?" Evelyn didn't answer. Her attention had already shifted upward toward the ceiling as another sound echoed faintly through the aircraft. Not turbulence. Not thunder. Something mechanical. Something wrong. Then the cabin lights flickered once. The second flicker lasted longer. This time the cabin lights dimmed low enough for passengers to notice. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Only the storm remained, pounding against the aircraft like waves against steel. Somewhere near the back, a man whispered, "That is not normal." The plane shuddered again. Not the rolling turbulence from earlier. This felt sharper, uneven, like something underneath them was struggling to stay balanced. Evelyn slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. The man beside her stared. "Seriously? Sit down." She ignored him, eyes fixed toward the left wing. A faint orange reflection flashed across the engine, housing for less than a second before vanishing into the ring. Her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. Up front, the flight attendants were speaking quickly into intercom phones now, their smiles gone. One of them nearly dropped a handheld flashlight when another violent jolt slammed through the cabin. Several oxygen masks loosened overhead, but did not deploy completely. Children started crying again. A teenager across the aisle pulled out his phone, even though there was no signal at 36,000 feet. People always reached for something familiar when panic arrived. Evelyn stepped into the aisle carefully, steady despite the shaking floor beneath her feet. "Ma'am, you need to sit down now," the nearest attendant said sharply. Evelyn looked toward the ceiling panels. "Your pressure system is fluctuating." The attendant blinked. What? You should prep the cabin early. Another hard vibration interrupted her. Somewhere beneath the floor came a deep metallic thump that did not belong in commercial air travel. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. Hydraulic imbalance. Maybe worse. The attendant crossed her arms defensively. Look, I appreciate the concern, but the cockpit has everything under control. Evelyn glanced toward the sealed cockpit door. No, she said quietly. They do not. Before the attendant could respond, the captain's voice returned over the speakers, this time strained enough that even nervous passengers noticed. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin immediately. No explanation followed. That was what frightened people most. Silence from the cockpit. The attendants moved fast now. Beverage service disappeared. Window shades were ordered open. Passengers were told to tighten seatbelts. One older man demanded answers until another sudden drop stole the words from his mouth. The aircraft lost altitude for 3 terrifying seconds. Gasps filled the cabin. A carry-on suitcase burst from an overhead bin, sliding halfway into the aisle before Evelyn caught it with one hand. The man beside her stared again. How are you still standing? She set the suitcase down gently. I used to fly through worse. He laughed nervously. Military. Evelyn did not answer. Another flicker crossed the lights. Then came the smell. Faint at first. Hot wiring. Burned insulation. Several rows ahead, a little girl looked toward her mother. Mom, why does it smell weird? The mother forced a smile she did not feel. Evelyn closed her eyes. Briefly, the memory hit hard and fast. Heat. Smoke. Warning alarms screaming through a headset somewhere far away in another lifetime. She opened her eyes again immediately, forcing the past back down where it belonged. Not here. Not now. A flight attendant rushed toward the cockpit with visible panic in her face. She pounded softly against the reinforced door before it opened just enough for someone inside to speak. Evelyn could not hear the words clearly over the storm, but she saw the attendant's expression drain of color. When the door sealed shut again, the woman turned toward the cabin, trying to stay composed. She failed. Evelyn walked toward her slowly. How bad is it? The attendant hesitated. Training told her not to say anything. Fear made her answer anyway. We lost part of the left hydraulic system. Evelyn looked once toward the shaking wing outside the window. Then she asked the question that made the attendant freeze completely. Did the backup pump fail too? The flight attendant did not answer right away. That alone told Evelyn everything she needed to know. Fear had a way of speaking before words ever could. Another violent shudder ripped through the aircraft. This one came with a deep, grinding vibration beneath the floor panels, strong enough to send several passengers gripping their armrests in panic. Somewhere in the cabin, somebody started crying openly now. No more pretending this was ordinary turbulence. Evelyn steadied herself against the overhead compartment while the attendant lowered her voice. The captain said the backup pressure is unstable. Evelyn stared at her for one long second. Then you are running out of time. The woman swallowed hard. How do you even know what any of this means? Before Evelyn could answer, the cabin lights suddenly went black. Gasps exploded through the darkness. For half a second, the only thing visible was lightning outside the windows, bright white flashes tearing through the clouds around them. Emergency floor lighting flickered on moments later, casting the cabin in dim blue strips along the aisle. It looked less like a commercial flight now, more like something caught between sky and ocean. The plane dropped again, harder this time. Oxygen masks finally deployed completely with sharp popping sounds overhead. Children screamed. Bags slid loose beneath seats. A man near row 22 shouted, "We are going down." Panic spread instantly, fast and contagious. Evelyn moved before anyone else did. Eyes on me. Her voice cut through the chaos without being loud. Strange how authority sometimes sounded quieter than fear. Several passengers looked toward her automatically. Masks on first. Tighten the straps. Slow breaths. The little girl across the aisle struggled with her oxygen mask, tiny hands shaking too badly to secure it properly. Evelyn crouched beside her seat despite the turbulence tossing the aircraft sideways every few seconds. You remember the lightning game? The girl nodded weakly. Good. Keep counting for me. Evelyn secured the mask gently over her face. One breath at a time. Nearby passengers started copying her calm without realizing it. That was how survival often worked. People borrowed steadiness from whoever still had some left. Another flight attendant rushed down the aisle. The cockpit needs medical assistance. The first officer collapsed. Evelyn looked up immediately. What happened? I do not know. Maybe stress. Maybe low oxygen. The attendant hesitated. The captain cannot handle everything alone. A sharp metallic bang echoed from somewhere beneath the left side of the aircraft. Evelyn's eyes moved instantly toward the wing again. Rain streaked violently across the window while the engine trembled under intermittent flashes of lightning. Something was failing fast now. She stood. Take me to the cockpit. The attendant blinked. Passengers are not allowed in there. Evelyn leaned closer, her voice low and controlled. If your hydraulic pressure collapses completely before descent, this aircraft becomes almost impossible to stabilize in crosswinds. The attendant's face went pale. How do you know that? Evelyn ignored the question. How far are we from Denver? About 100 miles. Too far. The plane lurched violently sideways again. Overhead bins burst open farther down the cabin. People shouted. Someone began praying loudly. Evelyn remained perfectly still in the center aisle while the storm roared around her. The attendant stared at her now with a completely different expression than before. Not annoyance anymore. Recognition. Not of who Evelyn was. Of what she was. Someone trained for moments exactly like this. Up front, the cockpit door cracked open briefly while another attendant stumbled out carrying emergency oxygen equipment. Through the narrow opening, Evelyn caught a glimpse of flashing warning lights washing the cockpit in red. She heard one sentence before the door sealed shut again. Captain Hayes sounded nothing like the calm voice passengers heard over the speakers earlier. I am losing left side control response. Evelyn closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Then she started walking toward the cockpit. The closer Evelyn got to the cockpit, the more the aircraft sounded wrong. Commercial planes were noisy by nature, but experienced ears learned the difference between stress and failure. This was failure. Deep beneath the floor came uneven hydraulic vibrations, pulsing through the cabin like a heartbeat losing rhythm. The emergency lights painted the aisle in dim blue while passengers sat frozen behind their oxygen masks, watching her move forward through the shaking aircraft as if she belonged there. Another violent drop sent several people crying out. Evelyn grabbed the overhead rail without breaking stride. One of the flight attendants hurried beside her now, breathing fast. The captain is trying to stabilize altitude. Evelyn nodded once. But the left control surfaces are lagging. The attendant looked stunned again. How can you possibly know that? Evelyn stopped near the cockpit door as another sharp alarm sounded from inside. She could hear multiple warning tones layered over each other now. Hydraulic pressure, flight control instability, maybe electrical faults too. The sounds pulled old memories dangerously close to the surface. Sandstorms, dark skies, emergency landings on damaged runways halfway across the world. She pushed the memories down immediately. Focus first. Survive first. The cockpit door opened suddenly. A pale-faced attendant stumbled out carrying an empty oxygen canister. Through the opening, Evelyn saw Captain Daniel Hayes gripping the controls tightly while red warning lights flashed across his face. The first officer sat slumped sideways in his seat with an oxygen mask over his mouth. Hayes looked up sharply when he noticed her standing there. Who the hell is she? The attendant answered quickly. She understands the systems. I do not need passengers in my cockpit. Evelyn spoke before the attendant could panic further. Your left hydraulic reservoir is bleeding pressure faster than the backup system can compensate. Hayes froze for half a second, just enough to notice. How do you know that? Because your rudder correction is delayed almost 2 seconds every time the aircraft rolls left. Another hard vibration shook the plane violently. Hayes fought the controls. Sweat lined his forehead now. Jesus Christ. Evelyn stepped closer to the doorway, but did not enter. How much fluid do you have left? Not enough. His voice stayed controlled, though barely. We lost primary response 12 minutes ago. Backup pressure is unstable. Evelyn looked at the instrument panel from where she stood. One quick scan. That was all she needed. Her eyes moved calmly across flashing indicators, fuel data, engine readings. The captain noticed the way she looked at the cockpit. Not like a passenger. Not even like a pilot impressed by controls. More like someone reading a familiar language. Who are you? He asked quietly. Evelyn ignored the question again. Crosswinds. 40 miles per hour near Denver. She shook her head immediately. You will not hold stable landing alignment if the left system collapses before approach. Hayes stared at her now with growing disbelief. You fly? A long time ago. Another alarm blared through the cockpit. The aircraft dipped sharply left before Hayes corrected it. Several passengers screamed behind them. Evelyn grabbed the cockpit frame to steady herself. Her breathing never changed. You need lower altitude before the system overheats completely, she said calmly. If that reservoir fails, manual correction alone will not save this aircraft. Hayes looked at her for a long second. Something about her voice felt wrong in the best possible way. Too calm, too precise, like she had lived through worse skies than this one. What did you fly? He asked. Evelyn glanced once toward the storm outside the windshield. Lightning illuminated the clouds ahead in violent white flashes. Then she answered softly. Aircraft that did not always come home. Silence filled the cockpit for one brief moment despite all the alarms. Then the radio crackled with heavy static. A controller's voice broke apart through interference. Flight 728, severe weather deviation approved. The transmission vanished again beneath static bursts. Evelyn's eyes shifted slowly toward the radio panel. Her expression changed for the first time since the crisis began. Not fear. Recognition. Static crawled across the cockpit speakers like distant electricity trapped inside the storm. Captain Hayes adjusted the radio frequency again, trying to punch through the interference while warning alarms continued flashing red across the instrument panel. Nothing held for more than a few seconds. Denver control faded in and out beneath bursts of noise. Outside the windshield, clouds rolled like black mountains lit by flashes of lightning every few moments. The aircraft shook constantly now. Not violently. Worse, unevenly. Like something heavy inside the machine was slowly tearing itself apart. Evelyn kept her eyes on the radio panel. Her breathing stayed perfectly measured while the rest of the cockpit felt seconds away from panic. Hayes noticed it again. Most people became louder when fear arrived. She became quieter. We are losing communication range, he muttered while gripping the controls. Storm interference is bouncing every signal. Evelyn listened carefully to the static for several seconds. Then she leaned slightly closer toward the center console. Not every signal. Hayes glanced at her. What? She pointed toward a secondary military emergency frequency buried beneath civilian channels. That band is still alive. He frowned immediately. That frequency is restricted. Yes. Another violent tremor rolled through the aircraft. The overhead cockpit lights flickered again before stabilizing. Somewhere behind them, passengers cried out in fear. Hayes fought the controls through another delayed response from the damaged left side system. Sweat ran down the side of his face now. Even if I could reach military frequencies, they would not respond to civilian traffic. Evelyn looked at the static-filled speaker for one long moment. Old memories drifted dangerously close again. Midnight missions over desert storms. Emergency corridors through hostile skies. Voices she had not heard in years. Some probably gone forever now. She pushed the memories down carefully. Focus first. Survive first. Hayes noticed her hesitation. You know that channel, do not you? Evelyn said nothing. The aircraft suddenly rolled hard left before Hayes corrected it with visible strain. Warning alarms screamed louder. The first officer groaned weakly in his seat, but remained barely conscious beneath the oxygen mask. Another system warning illuminated across the overhead panel. Hydraulic temperature critical. Hayes cursed under his breath. We are running out of options. Evelyn finally stepped closer to the radio. You need a clear descent corridor with minimal traffic. We already requested emergency routing. Civilian routing will not clear fast enough in weather this bad. Hayes stared at her again. Who exactly are you? Evelyn ignored the question for the third time. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached toward the military frequency selector. Her hand paused halfway there. Tiny scars crossed two of her knuckles, faded with time but impossible to miss under the flashing cockpit lights. Hayes noticed those too. Not office scars. Not ordinary life scars. The kind left behind by years most people never saw. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly against the selector switch. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. I have not used this channel in 8 years. Another burst of turbulence shook the aircraft violently enough to slam a loose checklist against the cockpit wall. Hayes looked toward the dark storm ahead, then back at her. Finally, he nodded once. Do it. For the first time since the nightmare began, hesitation crossed Evelyn's face. Not fear of crashing. Something deeper. like opening a door she had spent years trying to keep closed. Slowly, she lifted the radio microphone. Static hissed softly through the speaker. Her eyes unfocused for the briefest second, somewhere far beyond the storm outside. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded completely different. Calm. Precise. Military. Unidentified Air Force traffic. This is civilian aircraft requesting emergency vector corridor. Only Static answered. Hayes exhaled sharply. Nobody is there. Evelyn remained perfectly still, listening. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. Not to the frequency, to the past itself. Ghost Falcon requesting emergency passage. Silence filled the cockpit. Even the alarms suddenly felt distant. 3 seconds passed. 4. Then the radio cracked alive with a sharp burst of static before a male voice answered, low and stunned beneath heavy interference. Say again, call sign. Did you say Ghost Falcon? Captain Hayes slowly turned toward Evelyn Carter as the color drained from his face. The cockpit went completely still after the voice came through the radio. Not quiet. Still. Like every sound inside the aircraft had suddenly stepped backward to make room for those 2 words. Ghost Falcon. Captain Hayes stared at Evelyn while static crackled softly between them. Outside the windshield, lightning tore across the clouds in long white fractures. The storm did not care who she was. The sky did. The radio hissed again before the same voice returned, sharper now, disbelief barely hidden beneath military discipline. Identify yourself immediately. Evelyn held the microphone without speaking for several seconds. Her expression changed in a way Hayes could not fully understand. Not pride, not fear, something heavier, like hearing a name carved onto a grave suddenly spoken aloud again. Another warning alarm pulsed through the cockpit. Hydraulic pressure continued dropping. The aircraft trembled hard enough to shake the control panels. Hayes finally snapped out of the moment. Whoever they are, we need help now. Evelyn slowly lifted the radio again. Civilian aircraft flight 728. Hydraulic. Failure. Partial flight control degradation. 1 pilot incapacitated. Static burst loudly across the speakers before another voice entered the channel. Younger this time. Tense. Control, this is Viper 2-1. Did she just say Ghost Falcon? Silence followed. Then a third voice answered quietly in the background, almost like someone speaking away from their microphone. No way. She was declared missing years ago. Hayes looked at Evelyn again. Missing. Not retired. Not discharged. Missing. The aircraft rolled sharply left without warning. Hayes grabbed the controls hard, while warning sirens screamed through the cockpit. Evelyn steadied herself against the panel without losing balance. Outside, the storm clouds opened briefly. 2 fast-moving shadows cut across the darkness above them. Hayes saw them first. His eyes widened. My God! Lightning illuminated the shapes for half a second. Fighter jets. F-22 Raptors. They disappeared back into the clouds almost instantly. The radio crackled alive again, this time carrying a different voice entirely. Older. Calm. The kind of calm built from years spent making decisions in dangerous skies. Ghost Falcon, this is Sentinel Actual. Confirm authentication. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Hayes watched something flicker across her face then. Pain. Real pain. The kind buried deep enough that most people spent years pretending it was gone. Authentication code Delta Echo 71, she answered softly. Silence. Even the static disappeared for a moment. Then every pilot on the frequency seemed to stop breathing at once. Sentinel Actual answered first. Authentication confirmed. Another voice cut in immediately after, unable to hide the emotion anymore. Holy hell, it really is her. Hayes felt cold despite the heat inside the cockpit. He looked from the radio to Evelyn, trying to understand what kind of passenger ended up escorted by military fighters in the middle of a storm. Outside, the clouds split again. This time, both F-22s appeared clearly, sliding into formation alongside the damaged airliner with impossible precision. Their navigation lights flashed through the rain, while thunder rolled around all 3 aircraft. Together, passengers near the windows started shouting in confusion. Some pressed against the glass, trying to understand why fighter jets were flying beside them. Back in the cabin, fear slowly shifted into stunned silence. Evelyn never looked toward the jets. Her eyes stayed on the instrument panel. Captain, your descent angle is too steep for the remaining hydraulic pressure. Hayes blinked once. Right. He adjusted immediately, almost obeying her before thinking about it. Another transmission arrived through the radio. This one quieter. Personal. Ghost Falcon, we searched for you for 3 months after Kandahar. Evelyn's hand tightened slightly around the microphone. Just once. That was a long time ago, she answered. Not for us. Hayes watched her carefully now. The calm woman from seat 18A was disappearing piece by piece. In her place stood someone the United States Air Force still remembered after all these years. Rain streaked across the cockpit glass while the 2 F-22s held formation beside the damaged airliner with impossible steadiness. Their lights flashed through the storm every few seconds like silent guardians cutting paths through the clouds. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hayes could barely process what he was seeing. Military fighters did not break protocol for civilians. They definitely did not speak to passengers like lost family returning from the dead. Evelyn stood beside the radio in complete silence now, one hand resting lightly against the panel while hydraulic warnings continued flashing red around her. She looked less like a frightened traveler than someone who had stepped back into an old uniform nobody else could see. The radio crackled softly again. Ghost Falcon, we are clearing all regional traffic for your descent corridor. Hayes blinked. They are clearing the entire airspace. Affirmative, Sentinel Actual replied immediately. Priority path is now yours. Hayes stared at the storm ahead. Commercial aircraft usually waited for instructions. Tonight, the sky itself seemed to be moving aside for the woman from seat 18A. Another hard vibration rolled through the controls. Hayes corrected carefully while monitoring the failing hydraulic response. We are still losing pressure. Evelyn leaned toward the panel slightly. You need to keep your bank angles shallow. Sudden corrections will lock the remaining fluid valves. Hayes looked at her. How do you know these systems this well? She stayed quiet for several seconds. Then her eyes drifted toward the storm outside. Because I once landed worse aircraft than this without hydraulics at all. The answer hung in the cockpit like another warning light. Hayes almost asked another question but stopped himself. Some truths carried weight before details ever arrived. The younger pilot from earlier returned on the radio, voice quieter now. Respectful. Ma'am, is it true you brought Falcon Rescue Team out of Kandahar during the blackout storm? Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. The memory came back instantly. Black sky. Failing instruments. Sand tearing across the windshield hard enough to sound like bullets against metal. 6 wounded operators strapped inside a crippled rescue aircraft while alarms screamed non-stop through her headset. She remembered one of them praying quietly in the dark because he thought they were all about to die. She remembered lying to him, telling him they were going home. Her fingers tightened slightly against the radio mic. Some of them came home, she answered softly. Silence followed. The younger pilot spoke again after a moment. My older brother was on that mission. Evelyn's expression changed almost invisibly. Pain moved across her face too fast for most people to notice, but Hayes saw it. Lieutenant Connor Reed. The pilot continued quietly. He said you flew through a mountain storm after every other aircraft turned back. Evelyn looked down toward the cockpit floor for a second. Connor talked too much. The pilot laughed once through the radio. Emotional. Human. Yeah, he did. Another alarm pulsed sharply overhead. Hydraulic pressure critical. The aircraft trembled harder now as they descended through lower cloud layers. Denver's distant lights barely flickered through the storm far below. Hayes adjusted the controls carefully while sweat soaked through the collar of his uniform. Shirt. Evelyn studied the instrument readings in silence. Her voice remained calm when she finally spoke again. Captain, when the left system drops below minimum threshold, the aircraft will pull harder toward the damaged side. Can I still land her? Hayes asked quietly. Evelyn looked through the windshield toward the dark runway lights far ahead in the distance. Then she answered with the kind of honesty only experienced pilots used. Yes. She paused. But only if you stay calm before the aircraft does. Hayes let out a slow breath. Outside, one of the F-22s moved slightly closer beside the wing. Its pilot spoke one final time over the radio before approach. Good to have you back in the sky, Ghost Falcon. Evelyn did not answer right away. She simply watched the storm ahead while warning lights painted her face red. Finally, she whispered something so quietly Hayes almost missed it. I never really left. Denver appeared through the storm like scattered gold beneath black water. Runway lights flickered far ahead between sheets of rain while Flight 728 descended lower through violent crosswinds. Every alarm inside the cockpit still screamed for attention, but nobody reacted to them anymore. Fear had burned itself out hours ago. What remained now was focus. Captain Hayes gripped the controls carefully while the damaged aircraft trembled around them. The left hydraulic pressure indicator hovered dangerously close to failure. One wrong correction could lock the entire system. Evelyn stood beside him in complete silence, studying the instruments with calm eyes that never stopped moving. Outside the cockpit windows, the two F-22s stayed perfectly aligned beside the airliner, cutting through the storm like shadows, escorting something fragile home. The younger pilot spoke softly through the radio again. "Runway is fully cleared. Emergency crews are standing by." Hayes exhaled slowly. "Copy that." His voice sounded steadier now, not because the danger had passed, because someone beside him understood it completely. Another hard gust slammed the aircraft sideways. Warning tones erupted again as the left wing dipped lower than before. Hayes corrected carefully, but the controls lagged almost a full second behind him. The aircraft responded sluggishly, fighting every movement. Evelyn watched the attitude indicator closely. "Easy," she said quietly. "Do not chase the roll. Let the aircraft settle first." Hayes nodded once, adjusting more gently this time. The plane steadied slightly. "You have done this before," he muttered. Evelyn looked through the windshield toward the runway lights, glowing faintly through rain. Too many times. Another memory flashed through her mind without warning. A damaged rescue aircraft descending through smoke while soldiers waited below beside emergency flares in the middle of nowhere. Half her cockpit instruments dead. One engine barely alive. Somebody behind her bleeding quietly in the dark while she fought to keep the nose level long enough to land. She remembered hearing her own heartbeat louder than the alarms that night. She remembered the silence afterward most of all. The radio crackled softly. Sentinel Actual returned one final time. "Ghost Falcon, wind shear reported near runway threshold. Recommend caution below 1,000 feet." Evelyn answered automatically before she even realized it. "Understood." Hayes glanced at her briefly. That one word had sounded military again. Sharp. Immediate. Like no time at all had passed since she last flew missions through hostile skies. The runway grew larger ahead. Rain hammered across the windshield while crosswinds shoved hard against the aircraft. Cabin crew reports came through quickly now. Passengers secured. Cabin prepared. People praying quietly in the dark. Evelyn imagined the little girl still counting lightning flashes somewhere behind them. One breath at a time. "Altitude 1,000 feet, Hayes announced. His voice stayed controlled, but tension lined every syllable now. The aircraft suddenly jerked hard left again as hydraulic pressure dipped lower. The warning panel flashed amber then red. Hayes fought the controls carefully. "Come on." Evelyn leaned closer to the instrument display. "Do not force it. Let her fly herself down." Hayes swallowed hard. "That sounds insane. Aircraft want to survive too." He looked at her strangely for half a second before realizing she meant it. Another violent gust hit them moments later. The runway lights shifted sideways in the windshield. Several alarms screamed at once. Hayes tightened his grip instinctively. Evelyn placed one hand lightly against the side of his seat. "Not controlling. Grounding. Easy, Captain." Her voice stayed calm enough to cut through everything else. "You are almost home." Something in those words steadied him more than any training ever had. Hayes corrected gently this time instead of fighting the aircraft. Slowly the nose aligned with the runway again. Rain exploded beneath the landing lights now. The ground rushed upward fast. 50 feet. 40. 30. The cockpit shook violently as the wheels finally slammed against wet pavement with a roar that echoed through the entire aircraft. Passengers screamed once before realizing the plane was still moving forward intact. Hayes fought the controls through one final dangerous skid before the aircraft stabilized along the runway centerline. Then silence hit the cockpit all at once except for rain hammering against the fuselage. Flight 728 had landed. For several seconds after the aircraft stopped, nobody moved. Rain hammered against the fuselage while emergency vehicles surrounded the runway in flashing red and white lights. Inside the cabin, passengers sat frozen beneath dim emergency lighting, trying to understand the impossible feeling spreading through the silence around them. They were alive. Slowly the realization reached them row by row. A woman began crying softly into her hands. Someone whispered a prayer of thanks. Then applause started near the middle of the cabin. Weak at first, shaking hands clapping through leftover fear. Within moments, the entire aircraft erupted into emotional applause loud enough to echo through the cabin walls. Captain Hayes leaned back in his seat for the first time since the nightmare began. His hands trembled slightly now that he no longer needed them steady. He looked over at Evelyn standing beside the cockpit window, calm as ever, watching rain slide across the glass under airport floodlights. "You saved this aircraft," he said quietly. Evelyn shook her head once. No, her voice remained soft. "You landed it." Hayes almost laughed at that. After everything he had seen tonight, she still refused credit like it belonged to somebody else. The radio crackled one final time. Sentinel Actual's voice returned through gentle static. "Flight 728. Ground crews confirm all passengers safe." A pause followed before his tone changed slightly. More personal now. "Ghost Falcon, Command will want to know you are alive." Evelyn stared through the rain for several seconds before answering. "That is not necessary." Even the pilot sounded surprised by her response. "Ma'am, people searched years for answers." Her eyes lowered briefly toward the floor. "Some things are easier left buried." Silence settled across the frequency. Nobody argued with her. Outside the cockpit window, one of the F-22s slowly tilted its wings in a respectful salute before turning back toward the storm clouds. The second fighter followed moments later, both aircraft disappearing into the night sky without another word. Hayes watched them vanish. "They treated you like a legend." Evelyn said nothing. She simply removed the old silver chain hidden beneath her jacket collar and looked at the faded tag attached to it. Hayes noticed the scratched military insignia worn nearly smooth with time. "How many missions did you fly?" he asked quietly. Evelyn's eyes stayed on the tag. "Enough." The cockpit door finally opened behind them. Flight attendants entered slowly, some with tears still running down their faces. One of them looked directly at Evelyn. "The little girl from row 19 wants to thank you." Evelyn hesitated. For the first time all night, she looked uncomfortable. Not during the storm. Not during the emergency landing. Only now. She stepped back into the cabin carefully while exhausted passengers watched her with expressions somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. The little girl still clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. "You were not scared," she said softly. Evelyn knelt beside her seat. "Everybody gets scared. Then how did you stay calm?" The cabin grew quiet around them. Even strangers nearby waited for the answer. Evelyn looked out the rain-covered window for a moment before speaking. "Because panic does not help people get home." The little girl nodded seriously like she understood more than a child should. Her mother wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn gave a faint smile, then stood before anyone could say more. By the time airport crews finally opened the cabin doors, she was already walking quietly toward the exit with her small carry-on bag over one shoulder. No reporters. No applause now. Just the sound of rain outside and tired people watching her disappear down the jet bridge alone. Captain Hayes called after her one last time. "Evelyn." She stopped but did not turn around. Hayes struggled for the right words before finally asking the only thing that mattered anymore. "Who are you really?" For a moment the storm outside was the only answer. Then Evelyn Carter glanced back over her shoulder just enough for him to see the calm in her eyes again. Just someone who learned how to bring people home. Then she walked into the rain while somewhere far above the clouds, two distant fighter jets vanished silently into the dark sky.